Hi, Dave Scotland for cgswot.com and welcome to another tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at a studio lighting scenario where we've got a car and we're going to try to light it for pretty much a photographic promo type render. And this is pretty much the final render that you're going to get, and it does have a little bit of post-production treatment, just a little bit of depth blur, but it's almost exactly what we're going to get out of 3D Studio Max. Now, this is a VRay exercise, and I strongly recommend that if you are keen on doing any sort of 3D work, that you should have a look at VRay. It's a very powerful add to 3D Studio Max or Maya, and you definitely should have a look at it if you're interested in doing some nice accurate rendering. So this is the final result, and we're going to start just with our straight car. Here it is here. Now, the materials go a long way to making a render like this look good, and for this exercise, when it's not an exercise in materials, it's an exercise in lighting, in studio lighting. So the catch-22 with this sort of work is that you can't set up good materials unless you have a good lighting system set up, and you can't set up a good lighting system until you've got good materials. So this is where it does help to have something that has already got some great materials on it, and you may want to use the source files for this exercise in the future just to help set up new lighting rigs, knowing that the materials are actually set correctly for this object, and then you can use that lighting rig for other objects or other projects. So this is our scene. We just got a car. It's set up at world 0, so you'll see there that it's perfectly at world 0 with the tires resting right on the ground plane of world 0. And the first thing we need to do is set up a set that this object is going to sit in to represent a studio set environment. And this is the easiest way I've found to set up a nice curved wall scenario for a set. So I'm just going to bring up a front view, and we're going to use our line tool. And if we click on our line tool, the first point we're going to click at is right at world 0 here. And then I'm going to hold shift to make sure we get a nice straight line, and click again. And if I come up a little bit to about here, and then hold shift again to go straight up, and I'm going to click again and then right click to finish the line. So just might make it a yellow color so we can see what's going on there. And we're going to go into the modify tab. Now at the moment we don't have any curve here, but we'll address that in a second. First thing I want to do in vertex mode inside the line modifier tab here, I'm just going to highlight it and bring up my move tool, and I'm going to right click on all of the spinners down the bottom, and that sets them to 0, and it means that that vertice there is right at world 0. This one out here, we want to make sure that on the Z it's 0 and on the Y it's 0. The X is fine because it's the distance out here, and we want to leave that. These guys should be fine because they're in line with one another because we use the shift key while we drew them. So we want to select these two here and right click, and in the Bezier section I want to set them to Bezier corners, and that gives us some little handles. I want to bring those handles down to the ground plane here, and on this one, now you will notice as I'm trying to drag it right, it will only let me drag up and down, and that's because of these constraints. Now if you're missing this, just right click up the top here, and you've got axes constraints to bring those up. And what I want is X and Y, and that way I can drag this in the X and Y. We don't want to drag it in the Z, and then I can pull this one out as well. And the idea is to get a nice smooth curve leading up to the straight part of the wall here. You definitely don't want to pull it down below like this. It has to stay somewhere above or right on the line. So I've found that that's probably going to do us nicely, and you can see there's a nice smooth curve there. Now what you may actually have, this is remembering my last operation, and it's set my interpolation here for the line to 70. What you may actually have is 6 as a default, and notice here I've got these squared off sections of my line. That's because there are 6 steps in between every vertice, and you definitely want to pull that up to make it a nice smooth line. I'm going to pull that up to about 70. It's a very simple shape, so 70 is going to be okay. It's not going to be too heavy. And there's our line ready to create our set. So the next thing we want to do, and I'm just going to flip around to a perspective view, get rid of my axes for now. I'm going to add a modifier called lathe. So just drag down, find the lathe tool, there it is there. And straight away we get a very weird looking object here, and it's got, the reason why it is so bizarre looking is where the axis is positioned. Now I'll click on the axis, just go to a front view and drag that axis to the left, and you'll see that we're going to start to get this semicircle, half, or for you guys actually, this will be by default 360. So it should actually, when you first create it, it should look like almost like a top hat shape like this. But if you click on the axis and drag it over, in fact, we can actually right click here in the X to perfectly align it. Leave the Z where it is. Just go to a front view wireframe and show you what we've done there. So we've just dragged this axis over, and we've actually lined it up with 0 and 0 for X and Y. And that gives us this perfect looking cylinder here. Another thing that you guys might see, because this is remembering some of the last settings I used, this segments will probably be set to 12, and that's going to give you something that pretty much looks like this. And we need to ramp that up until we get a nice smooth cylinder shape. I think 200 should be okay. And then in a top view, I just want to reduce the degrees to 180, and that means we only get half of that object. Another thing that may be happening for you is down in the line tool, optimize is normally ticked on by default. Now if I come back up to here and go to a shaded mode, notice these anomalies that I'm getting around the car here. The reason for that, and they will actually turn up in the render as well. Now the reason for that is that optimize, if I just bring up a wireframe so you can see what's happening, notice between this curve starting area here and all the way back to the center, there are no segments that run around this semicircle. That's because the line tool is trying to optimize how many segments it's using. It's saying that there's no undulation, or it's not going up and down or anything, so I don't need any segments there, and I'll optimize it and just put straight lines. If you switch that off in the line tool and then come back into your lathe, I now have those segments, plus we've gotten rid of that problem that was happening as well. So the next thing we want to do is pull the front edge of this object out so that we've got more of a flat ground surface. So to do that, we're just going to add an edit poly, and I'm going to go into edge mode. I'm going to select the leading edge of this object, and I'm going to click on loop, and that gives me all of the leading edge on that left hand side. Now we need to repeat it on the right hand side, so we just hold Control, click on one of those segments and then loop, and now in a top view we can drag this down to create our set. And if we look at this outside of a shaded mode, switch off the wireframe, there's our set, and it's built, ready to go, but we need to check how it's rendering. Now if I bring it to sort of an angle like this and render it, what you'll see is the inside is actually visible, but the outside is dark. Now you may actually have something that looks a lot different to that, and that's because in the lathe tool, I'm just going to come back down to lathe, my flip normals is ticked. Yours is probably not ticked, and yours will render like this, which is the outside is visible but the inside is invisible or see-through. So you make sure that it is the inside that is actually going to render, and that's shown in the render there. So do make sure that that's correct, that the flip normals is showing the right side of our set, the inside. So that's fine. We're just going to call that set main, and we might as well at this stage give it a material. So I'm bringing up my material editor, and I'm going to click on standard and go to a VRay material, and I'm going to make it in the diffuse swatch here almost white. Something like that is fine. I'm going to give it a little bit of reflection, just a hint. I'm just going to drag it down, and to see how much reflection, I'm just going to click on the background here, and you can see there that it's reflecting in that surface. Probably a bit too much. Drag it back. That's probably is all I want on that reflection. Click and drag onto the set. We can name this set matte and close that down for now. So if we render that now, we have a very simple set, and our car's positioned right in the center of it. One thing I don't like about it is the set is a little bit narrow from left to right. So the easiest thing to do here is to scale it. Just go to a top view and notice where the gizmo is. It's easier to scale it from the center, so just go into hierarchy, effect pivot only, and center to object. And now when we scale it, we'll be scaling it from that world 0 or the center. Just pull it out a little bit. Something like that is going to work nicely. That gives us a bit more room to get in there with lights and things like that without being too confused. And just from a front view, I definitely want to make sure in a wireframe that my ground plane is right where the tires are, and it's working great. So the next thing we need to do is set up a little bit of lighting. I'm just going to go to a top view now and go back to my creation tab and click on lights. Now we're going to be using VRay lights. We may use an omni light later on just to isolate a little bit of reflection or specularity, but we'll get to that later. I'm going to create, just in wireframe mode, I'm going to create a VRay light, just a standard VRay light. I'm just going to pull this, it should be fine. Might as well pull it across. And we're going to set up some settings here. I'm going to give it a multiplier of 10 for now. The multiplier is all about the space, the size of the light. There's a lot of things, so you may have to play with those figures. I'm going to leave color as the mode, and we're going to come down here. I'm going to make sure invisible is ticked. I'm going to leave ignore light normals, and the only thing, and I want cast shadows ticked. And the only thing down the bottom here I want is affect diffuse. I don't want it to affect the specular, and I don't want to affect the reflections. So just click and drag slightly smaller than the car. And that should be about right. We can adjust it in a second. And at the moment we've created it right on the ground plane. So just pull it up so that it's about twice the height of the car. Something like that should be fine. Now we're just going to arc around a little bit, hit P for perspective view, and then just give it a quick render and see how that is actually working in the space. And you can see we've got some nice lighting happening on top of the car, and it's working very well. So top light is all set up. We just need to name it now, so just go into the modify tab. We're just going to call this top light. And everything else, we can come back and fine tune it later on. At the moment, we're going to leave the subdivisions as at 8. And if I show you the last render, see this little speckle pattern that's on the ground around the shadows? That is caused by the subdivision number in the light. So if I was to ramp that up at this stage, we would get much smoother shadows. We wouldn't get that speckled pattern, but it would take a lot longer to render. And we want to keep our render times fairly short while we're doing our setup. Now if we have a look at our render, we need to illuminate the front of the car, and we also need to illuminate the side here. We don't need to be concerned with the other side or the back, but if you had an animated camera that was animating around this car, you would need to consider lighting those other sides. So let's go ahead and go to a front view and set up our front light. So I'm just going to go back into my VRay lights again, and I'm going to click it so that it's roughly in this sort of area, inside the window as far as width, and then down to around about where the grill is, should be fine. Go to a left view and then pull that light back, probably about half the length of the car back. I'm just going to pull it up slightly and rotate it, like so. So now I want to switch off cast shadows for that light and just leave on effect diffuse. Now if I come around to a perspective view again and slide around, give that a render, you'll see that we're going to get a little bit of an issue. What's actually happening is that light is blooming out the ground in front of the car. That's the first problem, but the second problem is it's actually illuminating our shadow that's underneath the car, and we don't want that. So the easiest way to do that, to take care of this situation, is to tell that light to only illuminate the car, or to not illuminate our set. So at the top of the light settings, we can go into exclude and then find our set main, click across so that it now appears in this column, make sure exclude is there and go OK. And when we render it now, you'll see that we won't illuminate the ground or any other part of the set. We won't illuminate the shadows that are under the car, but we will get some nice front lighting on the front of the car, and that's working nicely. So let's rename that. We'll call that front light, and we might reduce the multiplier at this stage to, let's go 6.5 on the multipliers, because I want the main light, or the dominant light, to be the top light. It's just a very studio way of doing things. Just go to a top view now, and I'm going to duplicate this light. I'm going to hold shift and rotate it 90 degrees and as a copy. Now it's easier when you have the angle snap on to rotate a perfect 90 degrees. And I'm just going to pull it over, line it up with the side of the car, just pull it back slightly, go to a front view, make sure that the angle is okay, something like that looks good, go off the arrow, and I just might make it a little bit taller, that's probably it, and then from a top view I'm going to make it a little bit wider, and that looks pretty good. So let's come in now to a perspective, hit P, and just see how that is working. So you'll notice the more and more we do, it gets us a little bit slower with our test renders, and it looks to me like that side light might be a little bit too bright. So because it was a copy and not an instance, we can independently change its settings. I'm going to put this down to 4.5, and I'm also going to rename it. This one's going to be side light, and give that a quick render and see how it's happening. I just want to get a little bit darker on the edge here, just so that the reflections that we're about to set up are going to work. That's looking pretty good. Now at this stage I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So it's always good to stay organized in 3D Studio Max. So at the moment everything is sitting, this is Layer Manager, and we can access it up here with Layer Manager. Everything is sitting in the default layer, and we don't want that. So I want to grab all three of my lights, and I can click this to select highlighted objects. If I click it, now all three of my lights are highlighted in the scene here. I'm going to click on Create New Layer containing selected objects. And down the bottom here, I now have a new layer. I can click on it, and this is going to be lights. I now have two layers, default and lights, and my lights are in my lights layer. I also want to isolate the set. So I'm going to click on the set in the viewport, and then just create new layer and type set, and you'll see now that I have one object in the set. And I'm also going to create a camera now. We'll just leave this open for a sec. In fact, I'll just drag it off screen. The easiest way to create a camera is to go into a perspective view, hit P, make sure you're in a perspective view, and then use the Alt middle mouse button just to move around and try to get the angle that you're going for. Now I want a nice low angle. I want something that's going to show the grille, which is a lot of the attitude and style of the car is sort of focused on the grille. but also I want to see the sort of length of the car. I want to see the height. So I don't want it too low. Something like that looks pretty similar to a standard car scenario. That looks pretty good. And I'm going to create a camera. Now, I'm not going to use a VRay camera. I think at this stage it may confuse you a little bit more, and we will have to tweak a lot of the lights and things like that to get the VRay camera to work. And I just want to keep this as simple as possible. So I'm just going to create a normal camera. I'm just going to go, now that we've got this lined up and I'm in perspective mode, I can go View, Create Camera from View. And I now am looking through that camera. If I go to top view, you'll see that there is now a camera in the scene, exactly where we were just looking from a perspective view. Now, I tend to never use target cameras unless they're absolutely necessary, because they're a very unnatural way to treat a camera. And I do the same for After Effects as well. So I'm just going to go free camera for this one. I'm going to hit C to go back into that camera view. I'm just going to fine tune the positioning of this camera. I don't want too much space at the back here, so I might just rotate it around just slightly and bring it over. I want to catch a little bit of the far headlights there, so slide that back over a little bit, probably to about there, and I think that's working for what we need. And let's give it a quick render just to see if that camera angle is going to work for us. So I think it's working pretty well, and we can go ahead and just finish off our housekeeping. So just bring our layer set in. Now notice, because set was ticked, when we created the camera, it automatically went into set. And you do have to be careful of what is ticked when you're creating objects as to where they go in the layers. So I'm just going to click on that camera and create a new layer called Cams. And you'll see now that I have a camera in there, 3 lights in the lights, something in the set, and that means that everything else that's in the default is the car. So highlight them all, and then click Select Highlighted Objects, which selects it in the viewport, and then Create New Layer from Selection. And this one's going to be called Car Mesh. And now the car is in there. Now what I'm going to do is actually click on the highlighted, or use this button here to select the objects in the viewport. Right click and Object Properties. What I want to do is switch off Show Frozen in Grey, and then go OK. And that means that if I freeze it in our layer manager, nothing is going to be grayed out or have a default grey material, and that's going to work nicely. The camera also, at this stage, we don't want to accidentally move it around, so we can freeze it as well. And the set, we can do the same, click on the set in the viewport, Object Properties, and just untick Show Frozen in Grey, and freeze the set layer. So the only thing we should be able to access is our lights, and I might just change the name of lights to Lights / Reflectors, and that's what we're about to create. Now make sure that tick is in that layer, and that means anything we create will go into that layer. Okay, so we've got our render so far, and it's looking a lot better than what we had before. So we need to now bring this car to a production quality sort of image. And what a lot of people don't realize is that objects are positioned around the car in a photographic scenario to bring out the reflective qualities in the car in a very specific way. And it's actually, they move them around, it takes hours to move them around to give the car the absolute best reflections, to showcase the lines, the materials, the Duco, the polish. The whole thing is based on, really, on reflections. So this is what we're going to do. I'm just going to go to a top view for now. In fact, I'll go for a front view, and we'll do the front reflector first. So I'm just going to go back into my geometry. I'm going to click on a plane, and I'm going to click and drag. In fact, I'll do a vertical plane first, and that's about the size that we want, and use the right click method to zero those out at world center. Pick it up, something like that is fine. Go to the top view and pull it back to say about this position, maybe a little bit back, just behind the light is fine. Something like that looks good. Now at the moment our plane is actually facing out and not in. We're going to rotate that around 180 degrees. So it's rotate around 180, and there it is there. So I'm just going to come around so we can see that plane. The other thing I'm going to do, just to make life a lot easier for us, is I'm just going to go to my layer manager, unfreeze set, select it, right click on object properties, and I'm going to say display as box and go OK. Now you'll see now, and I'll freeze it again. You'll see now in the viewport that our set is a box, and it means that we can view all the way around without having to worry about seeing through that set. It doesn't affect the render at all. It will still render as normal. So we need a material for our reflector. I'm just going to rename our plane to reflect front. And I'll just put an underscore underneath that. So reflect front. 4x4, that's going to be fine. You can go 1x1 for the segments. And just to bring up our material editor. Now this material is very simple. We'll make this a standard material just to make life a bit easier for us. So go back and just turn this into a standard material. Click on the diffuse, go white, self-illumination, wind that up to 100. In the opacity, click on the swatch here so that we can use a map in the opacity, and we're going to use a gradient ramp. So click on gradient ramp. Also make your viewport here, your little material swatch, a box, just so we can more accurately see a flat surface. And then in your gradient you want white in the middle, so double click and make that one white. Double click on this one, make it black, and you'll see up in the viewport we now get this white hot spot through the center. You can click a new black one and just bring it up slightly, something like that, and that's going to give us a nice white solid line with a nice soft fall off to invisibility. You can see here that it's actually invisible, and we're going to click and drag that onto our reflector. We can show something like that, and we'll call this reflector material. Now if I just go back to my camera view, hide this. Now I'm just going to bring up my last render and click to clone it. Just pull it over here, and just before we re-render again with our reflector, so I'm just going to grab my reflector. I think it's a little bit back too far. I'm just going to pull it to about here. I want to make sure my lights aren't illuminating that reflector. So if I just go exclude, and at the moment the set is excluded, but also I want the reflector. So if I just type REFL, it should come up with reflector. There it is there, reflector front. Go OK. And just in the material editor, make sure that is actually 100% self-illuminated. And it is. Maybe bring it a little bit closer. Something like that. Go to our camera view and just see if there's a difference in that render. And it's probably good that this happened, because I can explain what's happening here. Now there's two things we need to correct. One is it shouldn't be visible. You will see in the car render that there is a little bit of subtle difference, but not enough. But it's visible. We can see the reflector in the render, and we don't want that. So if we highlight the reflector and it's selected here, right click, object properties, and visible to camera should not be ticked, and we go OK. The other thing is, because of our angle, I'm just going to pull this off to the side, go to a top view, because of the angle of the camera, and if I select the camera go to a wireframe. If I select our camera, we've frozen the camera, so just unfreeze the camera so we can select it. I switch on the cone and the other thing I'll need to do while I'm in camera is go to a 35mm lens type. So I can probably increase the target distance just to bring the cone out so we can make some better judgments, and then lock it up, freeze it up again. So here is our reflective surface, which is the front of the car. The camera is beaming over here, but by the time it hits the surface, we need to put our reflector over here in order to get it to register as a reflection. So I'm just going to move it over, go camera, and just see if we can pick up a little bit better reflection on the car. Now we have changed the lens millimeter setting, and that means we need to reassess where our camera is positioned, but you can now see down through the center of the car. In fact, I'd like to show you properly how much of a difference it makes. So I'm just going to go show safe frame so that I can judge exactly where everything is here. I'm going to bring the camera in slightly, maybe rotate it, arc it around just a bit, pull it back. Something like that is going to work, and this reflector will do a standard render, and this is the one with the reflector on, and then I'm going to hide the reflector and show you the difference between the two. So there's our standard render, and you can see this light, this reflection coming down through the center of that front bumper there. I'm just going to clone this and leave it over here, and our reflector, I'm going to right click, hide selected, and re-render. Now when you hide something in 3D Max, it won't render unless it's a light or a camera that you hide, and then there's no difference. Okay, so there's a very real difference between these two objects when it comes to the front of the car. Have a look at the silver trim that's around the grille and this piece of painted metal through the middle. Over here, this is with the reflector switched on. We get a lot better silver grille render, plus that part at the middle is actually quite, it's quite nicer when it comes to the reflective nature of the paint. Now, I'm going to leave this up here for a second. I'm going to unhide the reflector and just click on it here, go into the material editor. If you want tighter reflections, just bring in this outer black markers here in your gradient ramp, and if I give that a render, you'll see that we actually get a much tighter reflection down through the center of the grille here. It may mean that you need to reposition the reflector a little bit because it's not quite as wide, and we'll know here in a second whether that's working okay. And you'll see that this is much softer over here, and this is a lot tighter. So I think the reflector, the way it is at the moment, is going to be okay. I might just bring it out just slightly, something like that. And I might also put a little bit more of a hot spot in the center, and that's going to work nicely. So we've got one reflector working there. We need to now do a top reflector. And the easiest way to do that is to grab this reflector here, go to a left view, rotate it 90 degrees, and we're going to call this reflect top. Go OK. I'm going to move it up above our car, so position it right in the middle. Go to the top view, pull it over, maybe pull it over slightly on an angle, maybe over here. We need to scale it out beyond the top and the bottom of the car, something like that. In fact, I prefer to actually scale this right out like this, and that way we don't get any hard edges on the end of it. And you'll notice that it covers that top section. and we'll just make sure that the top light, if we select it, excludes any reflectors as well. So this time we've got 2 reflectors, and we will need to revisit these lights and make sure that none of the reflectors are included in the light. Okay, and this one here also should have the top one not excluded. We'll go okay. So let's give that a little bit of a render. We'll show the last render and then clone it and then re-render. I think it's valuable to show you the differences we're implementing as we go along. And straight away, you can see the windshield here has a lot more reflection happening at the top. And if I put those side by side, especially back here on the back of the car, there's another reflection on the windshield here. And I think what I'm going to do is, just in a top view, I'm going to pull that over, select that top reflector. Rather than just pulling it straight over, I'm going to put it on a bit of an angle, move it over a little bit, and see what we get. Just try to judge these angles. It's almost an exercise similar to when you play snooker or pool. You have to try to judge what's going to happen when it bounces off a surface and where to place your reflection or reflectors. So now I'm getting this nice reflection across the window here, and it's working pretty good. So I'm going to take that reflector, just go to a front view, and I'm going to rotate it. I might just rotate it locally now that it's sort of skewed to the left a bit. I'm going to shift and rotate it around 90 degrees, and I'm going to call this side. So this is my side reflector. I'm going to go to the left a little bit, go to a top view, try to work out where we're putting it. So probably about there, and just rotate it back so that it's straight, and if anything, rotate it a little bit over, similar to how we have the light rotated, and then I'm going to bring it back. Now we're looking at a slight down angle on the camera, so I'm going to put it down, maybe even rotate it the opposite to the way the light is, something like that. So we can see now where we've got that reflector positioned, and we'll see how that's actually working. And you'll see that it's very difficult to see what's going on, and that can be rectified by just going Object Properties, Display as Box. The same as the set, we now just see the outline of it instead of seeing straight through it. So this is a major reflector, and it will take a little bit of nudging and pulling around. You'll notice there's a massive difference to the side of the car now. It has these lots and lots of nice reflections happening, but notice here that it's cut off. Now I've found the easiest way to rectify this situation is, let's delete that reflector. What I'm going to do is actually create a cylinder, and I'm going to create it right at world center. Just pull it out, make it fairly tall enough to encompass the car, and then I'm going to change some settings. I want a nice smooth edged cylinder. Just go to a top view, and we do that by increasing the sides. That's going to give me a nice smooth circular or round edge. And height segments, we don't care about the height segments. And then I'm going to put an edit poly on top of it, just so that I can select the top and delete it, and the bottom and delete it. So what we're left with is a cylinder that goes right the way around the car. I'm going to select all of the polygons, and I'm going to flip the polygons. And just like flip normals for the lathe tool before, by flipping, it's now the inside of the cylinder that is going to be visible, not the outside. So I can apply the reflector material to it. Now unfortunately, the mapping is not going to suit it, and it's just putting it sort of at the front of the cylinder. So we're just going to put a UVW map on the front of it. We're going to leave it as a plane, and we're just going to find the right axes. So leave it as a planar and just go X, and X is the one that's going to suit our needs. So we now have a reflector that's in the shape of a cylinder, and all we need to do now is scale that reflector down a little bit to bring it a lot tighter, like this. And also the UVW map needs to be scaled down a little bit so that we do get that transparent edges. You'll see there, we're getting those nice transparent edges. And the last thing we want to do is make sure this cylinder isn't cutting into our set. So if we just bring up our manager here and unfreeze the set and select the set, right click, object properties, display as a box, just untick that, and we're just trying to work out whether our, and it looks fine. I don't think it's cutting into the geometry, and it's going to work nicely. So we can freeze that back up again, or select it, right click. We could probably leave it as a set for now, just so that we can see exactly what's going on. Go back to our camera view. We'll select our cylinder, which we'll call our reflect horizontal, and right click, object properties, display as a box. Now give that a render, and you'll find, whoop, now the one thing that we didn't do then was to go into the object properties and make it non-visible to camera, and that's why it rendered in that last render. So you'll see now that we have some really nice reflective properties on the side of the car. They're picking up on the wheels, and it's also coming right around the front of the car as well. We're getting our vertical front reflector working nicely, but we're also getting one that comes around the front. It's around the side. So we're really looking at something that is close to what we're looking for. The only other thing I'd probably do is just grab our front reflector. Just go to a wireframe, and we definitely don't want realistic. We just pick that front reflector there. Maybe arc around a little bit, select it. It's a little hard to select because we've set it as a box, or I'm trying to select it from the back actually, which is why it's a little hard to select. So we'll pull it off to the side, but then we'll rotate it around a little bit, because remember, we're trying to judge the angle that we're going to see it using the camera. We also might grab this one here and just nudge it over slightly and rotate it back a little bit. Come back to our camera view, give it a render. Okay, so we're getting something that's looking very nice. I think everything's working really quite well. I don't like the reflective nature on the set over in the background here. So what I'm going to do is just bring up the material for the set and pull this reflect value back to black so that there is in fact no reflection. And the other thing I want to do is to select the set, right click, and bring up, I'll right click a bit higher so we can bring up that menu. Go to VRay properties. What I want is an alpha contribution of -1, and I'll explain what that means in a second. Go close, and give that a quick render. Now straight away we're going to get rid of those reflective elements that I didn't particularly like. And also, if I click on the alpha button here, you'll see that I just have the car. Now that's a very powerful thing to have when you save this file and bring it into After Effects or Photoshop. You then have an alpha, so you can do treatment on either the background or the car independently. So that works quite nicely, and I believe I'll just zoom in a little bit here because I'm still seeing something in the background. of this object. Not really sure what this is here. So let's just check our lighting and just make sure that our lights are not illuminating. Ooh, move the set for a sec. Exclude, set main, top, we'll put reflect, just to get that horizontal reflect in there, and we need to do that for the top light as well. Make sure that so all of the reflectors should not be illuminated by our lights. And exclude, put that horizontal in there. And everything else should be okay. What I think I'm going to do is just move my top light. Let's go to a front view here for a sec. Just going to move my top light down slightly and then reduce the multiplier to 9. Just trying to get a little bit darker off in the distance. And I didn't want to affect too much of the lighting on the top of the car, and I think it's working okay. So generally I think we've got something that's pretty close to what we're looking for. So the only other thing I might take is my set here and just scale it a little bit more out in width, just so that it drops into darkness a little bit more over there. I'm going to go into that top light that's creating shadows. And I'm going to put the subdivisions up. Let's put it up to 40. You can go a little bit higher if you want to. And what that's going to do is it's going to slow down the render, but it's also going to get rid of that that speckled shadow anomaly that's happening on the ground plane there. The other thing, if I look at my scene here, these headlights just aren't shining out as much as they should because they're very reflective. Now, if I select my car mesh here and unfreeze it just so that I can get into the individual objects, I've got front light units and I can tell that they're the right ones just by temporarily moving them. I'm going to set up, so it's called front light units. What I'm going to do is set up a light, just a standard Omni light, and I'm just going to go to a top view here and I'm going to put it right in front of those headlights and pull it up to about here, and I'm going to include in the settings for that Omni light just those headlights. So it was front light units, and make sure include is selected. And what I'm going to do with that is actually pull the right click open all so we can see everything, and I'm just going to pull the diffuse out and just have specular for these lights. So this will take a little bit longer to render because we've changed the shadow properties of the main light, but it should give us something that's a little bit more accurate for a car model as far as the lights are concerned here. Okay, so you can see there that that's worked a lot better for some of the reflective elements inside those headlights. We could have maybe switched on the diffuse, but you know, feel free to experiment that, and also duplicate that light down and put it right in front of this spotlight down the bottom here, and find out which piece of geometry actually needs to be included. But generally speaking, everything is looking quite nice for a production type studio lighting scenario, albeit very quick. Now in a real world production or 3D production VRay product, you would spend a lot more time tweaking a lot of these things, but I think I've given you enough of a starting point. Looks like we are still getting a little bit of reflection on our set. So if I just bring up the material, yeah, you can just see a hint of reflection there. So I want to make sure that's back to 0. Yeah, so basically you've got what you need. You've got an alpha for the 2. The only other thing you would do is do an ambient occlusion pass to bring out a lot more detail in the nooks and crannies of the, you'll see here in the in the door handle area, there should be a little bit of shadow under the door handles. There should be a little bit more shadow down in these nooks and crannies here. In fact, if I just bring up the image that we had to start with, you'll see here that there is some nice shadows inside these areas, and then also the panel gaps in between the panels are much more defined than our recent render. Now, I did that using a ambient occlusion pass. Now, there is a really quick and easy way to do an ambient occlusion pass, and what I'm going to do is just save. Actually, I won't save it. You'll be able to open this file in your download. This is the easiest way to set up an ambient occlusion pass, I think, in using VRay. So, at the moment, we've got all of the car materials and the set materials. But what we want to do is create a brand new material. We'll just call this AO. It's a standard material, but in the diffuse swatch, I'm going to set a map to VRay Dirt. If I double click it, I now have VRay Dirt. I'm going to put this up to, say, 100 millimeters. And subdivisions, let's put that up to 20. And back in the main main material swatch here, just make that white. It doesn't really matter too much because we've got a diffuse in there, but pull the self-illumination up to 100. Now, in your VRay settings, go to the Global Switches tab, switch on Material Override, pull that over onto the button as an instance, and see it'll match here. Now what we want to do is switch off lights, hidden lights, shadows, reflection and refraction, and go up into the render settings, environment, and change your environment to white and go OK. Now give that a render, and what you'll get is an ambient occlusion of your scene. Now what we're actually seeing here is, just select our reflector. In fact, if we just go H and type in reflector, 1, 2, 3, go OK, right click, object properties, just make sure they're not visible to camera and they're not renderable. And that way, when we do this ambient occlusion pass, we're not going to get these edges around here from those reflectors. Now the reflectors don't make any difference at all to the ambient occlusion pass, and you'll see now that we get these nice dark details here. In After Effects and Photoshop, all you do is you bring that in and you use it as a multiply layer over the top of your beauty render that we did before, and you get all of this nice dark detail in the areas where the light simply can't get into. And it's only through using that that we get a lot of this nice detail inside this dark shadow areas inside all of these nooks and crannies where light just simply can't get into. Okay, so basically you've got something to get on with there. I'm going to supply the car. It's a Mitsubishi ASX model that I put together, and you'll be able to start from scratch, and the materials will be on the car, so you can also use those materials for some other car vehicles that you might do yourself or download. But I think the real important thing is to make sure that you have a vehicle that is actually materialed correctly before you try to attempt to do any lighting, because you need to assess how the lights are working on a material that actually works. Likewise, you shouldn't be doing any material work unless you are working in a lit scenario where there are shadows, where there are good accurate lights being used, because you won't get a true representation of how those lights are actually working. So it's a bit of a catch-22, but once you have a file that you can use, either a vehicle file or an object file to set up lighting, or a lighting file to set up vehicle materials, then you won't have a problem in the future. So that's pretty much wraps it up for a nice VRay car production or photographic production render. And feel free to drop us a line at cgswot.com, and keep an eye out for some of the workshops that we've got coming up. I'm going to do an extensive workshop with VRay materials and lighting coming up soon, and make sure you give this one a try. So until next time, bye for now.